When a new company pops up and tries to make a name for itself, the most important part is leaving a good first impression. It doesn't have to shake the earth or anything, just make sure people don't scowl when they see them next time. The bedrock of a solid first outing is what lets you iterate upon and improve, give you the chance to refine what you have and make good on your potential. But there's a flip side to that. Everybody gets their first shot, but what if it ricochets off the wall and hits you in the head? Today, we're talking about developers who made one game before going bust. Now, despite what the immediate thought might be, these games didn't all fail due to a lack of quality. There's a very thorough stabbing in my future if I call some of these games bad. I think that makes it more interesting when the quality and reception of a game isn't directly tied to the fate of its company, when outside factors and third parties are more to blame. For those worried there might not be any disasters in this one, don't worry, I found one. PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. I don't know, guys, a few more words might have sealed the deal. Isn't it weird nobody cares about this game? This was the biggest attempt by a major studio to ape Nintendo's success with Smash, and until Multiverses, I'd say it was the one with the most star power. Other companies would try, but it wouldn't be part of a major push, more like a tie-in game, Ninja Turtles Smash Up or Punch Time Explosion. PlayStation All-Stars should have worked. You'd expect it to at least have an audience today. It is PlayStation Smash Bros, but even among fighters kept alive by Discord servers, it's pretty meek. Among the various failures that PlayStation All-Stars endured, its greatest might be the failure of the very studio who created it, Superbot Games. So this game is meant to be a big celebration of the past 18 years of PlayStation. Who do you get to handle it? Top of that list has to be one of the companies who helped to sell all those PlayStations, Naughty Dog. Yes, the initial plans were for Naughty Dog to handle development of what would become PlayStation All-Stars. But at the time, they were in the middle of full development on The Last of Us, which they would be in for the next decade and a half. Somehow. This was floated around in 2009, and looking at the other Sony mainstay studios like Insomniac, Sucker Punch, and Santa Monica, they were all hard at work on their own projects, like Resistance and Infamous. Without any in-house or trusted studios to make the crossover fighter, or any that were really well-versed in fighting games to begin with, Sony decided an internal team would be put together to make the game happen, creating Superbot, or as it was known at the time, Broodworks. Sharon Studstill, a longtime producer on God of War, would be the studio founder. Chan Park, who had a decade of experience in game making, was the president, and creative director on the game would be Omar Kendall. PlayStation All-Stars did strike me as Juggalo affiliated, I just couldn't put my finger on it. The company switched its name from Broodworks to Superbot to prove it could do things, before privately showing off early concepts of All-Stars under the name Title Fight. We know it was private because PlayStation got upset when everybody saw it. Leaks would stay a problem for the whole of All-Stars development, up to the entire roster being leaked when one guy took an NDA as a suggestion and told everybody what he had seen when doing a focus test. The game would start out as a much different beast to what we ended up getting, with a much more overt focus on party gameplay than Smash, with goal-oriented game modes being the standard rather than an option like coin battles. Races and capture the flag would be the default, as fighting wasn't the goal, but rather a means to an end. You slowly choke out Parappa the Rappa because you want to score a goal. Eventually, though, the game was reworked to be solely fighting, and put things on track to a mixed reveal. No, PlayStation fans were extremely happy. The game looked good. It was something they had been asking for a long time. The roster, all good on the most important front. Outside of that, though, the Sword of Damocles stopped dangling and dropped itself and the whole ass roof on top of them. So it's kind of like Sony Smash Bros. Watching interview and expo footage from the time of PlayStation All-Stars reveal, the topic of Smash is either fully avoided or mentioned as briefly as possible to avoid the stink of being a knockoff. Remember, back then, a Smash clone was a Smash clone. We didn't have Platform Fighter to help soften the blow. That label was very much a dirty word because Smash was such a distinctive formula that any game aping its style was looked down upon. A large amount of coverage of the game focused on this and asked what made the game more than just Sony Smash Brothers. The answers, though, weren't very good. Smash at its core is a sumo fight, wearing the opponent down to try and knock him out of the ring. All-Stars decided to forego ring-outs and instead structured the game around specials. Attacks don't drain the opponent's health or increase their KO potential, it gains you super meter to use for special moves. These specials are the only way to actually kill opponents, which made fights feel like busy work. Nothing you were doing actually got you closer to winning. All that mattered was meter building, which made for a tedious experience. More than anything, this probably killed the game's potential thanks to it just not being very fun to play. PlayStation fans might be able to look past the awkward roster, but when they actually start playing the game, they're just not having a good time. Speaking of the roster, even if you don't care about the gameplay or the comparisons to Smash or anything else, this is a scuffed-ass roster. Among the expected characters like Kratos, Nathan Drake, and Sweet Tooth were picks like that Princess from the PSN game of the same name, Sony Japan mascot Toru Inoue from a game that released last in Japan, and probably the biggest sore thumb of them all, Two Cole McGraths. Get this motherfucker out of my fighting games! The rest of the roster is made up of characters who are either fine choices or who don't really represent PlayStation at all. A Metal Gear character is a good get, since almost all of the games are exclusive to PlayStation, but they went with Raiden from Metal Gear Rising, a game that is on both Xbox and PlayStation. Noriko from Heavenly Sword? I mean, yeah, she is a PlayStation exclusive, but I don't think she would have been on anybody's list. Now on everybody's list, Big Daddy from BioShock, a game that nobody associates exclusively with PlayStation. It's not a bad roster on its own, but this is Sony Smash Bros, and it excluded major characters from Sony's history. Crash, Spyro, Lara Croft, Cloud, Snake, Alucard, the most obvious choices were the ones excluded. To cut Superbots some slack though, this wasn't their choice. Fact is, these characters are all owned by different companies who have different ideas of what they want put out there. In the case of Crash and Spyro, both owned by Activision, the price tag they were asking for was really, really high. And in Spyro's case, the version they'd include, his PS1 incarnation, didn't line up with the current slate of Skylanders games. A similar reason was given for Lara Croft. Tomb Raider was about to undergo a huge image change with the 2013 revival. Having red glasses and tight blue tank top Lara when the series was about to go in a drastically different direction didn't make any sense. Same actually goes for Dante. The new DMC game was coming out, so when Superbot asked Capcom to use Dante, who was born and thrived on the PS2, they got Dante. Superbot should just be happy they didn't ask for Virgin. To give the roster some credit, I think All-Stars does a much better job at selling this as a crossover fighter than Smash does. Having voiced rival cutscenes and stages crossing over mid-match is really, really cool, and allows for Sony franchises that would have never gotten a fighter to be represented, like Buzz and Everybody's Golf. Maybe there was some hope for characters like this to be included with DLC, but if that was going to happen, it'd be without Superbot. After the game's launch, the studio would part ways with Sony in February of 2013, less than half a year after the game's launch in November. The final two DLC characters of Zeus and fuck it why not Isaac Clarke would be handled by Santa Monica, which included Seth Killian, famous Street Fighter player and former Capcom employee, man with two final bosses named after him. A few things about Seth, as they relate to the game. Number 1, he joined development 4 months before the game launched, working with Santa Monica to support Superbot as a support studio. In that time, he admits his influence on the game was negligible. 4 months before launch is way too late to leave a real mark on a game. Number 2 is that when talking about the game's sales, he very importantly corrected himself when he said it sold great, and said it sold well. This corroborates PlayStation president Shuhei Yoshida, who said that the game sold well, over 1 million copies, but not enough to justify continuing the series, or development of the current game. Thirdly, if you look into the game, you'll find on the wiki that Seth Killian is listed as the designer, which sounds right, but like I said, he only joined development 4 months before the game finished. And looking into the credits of the game itself, it's weird. The team at Superbot aren't really credited. No, their names are there, but that's it. If you look on Moby Games, a great resource for researching game development, the developers of All Stars aren't actually credited. It doesn't credit what they did. At the end of the game, it's just a big long list smushed together, and it doesn't really say what they did. Every other studio who worked on the game got credit, like Santa Monica and the marketing team. You found out everybody who worked there and what they did. But for Superbot, the company who did the lion's share of the work, nothing. If it weren't for interviews beforehand, names like Omar Kendall and Chan Park would have just been another name on the list. I can't remember any other games off the top of my head doing this, and it's extremely weird. If anybody knows why this was done, I'd love to know. As for Superbot post All Stars, it stalled almost immediately. Sony had deemed development on the game to be too costly, with the high price tag to use all these characters, and adding on even more with DLC would have just kept pumping money into a game they'd already given up on. So without any more PlayStation All-Stars to make, the PlayStation All-Stars company started to get worried. After losing Sony, they'd attempt to make a new fighting game, even proposing a rival school-style fighting game, but it never worked out. Before croaking, all they could manage was an edutainment app named Cuttlefish Friends, which is now completely lost. Superbot is a sad case, but given the situation it found itself in, I can't say it was surprising. Sony was not hiding the fact that Superbot was made to make this one game. And once the game is completed, and didn't warrant a sequel due to low sales, as low as 1 million might seem, keeping the studio around would have been a pointless endeavor. It's sad that the legacy of the studio is now just the blueprint of what the next Sony Smash game shouldn't be like. Now I'll admit, there isn't as much drama in the Superbot story as you might expect from a single game studio. I mean, to be one and done, something more than just low sales had to have happened, right? Who's ready to break the law? 38 Studios was a company started by Curt Schilling, who at that point was more used to being in video games than making them. Curt made his name as a baseball player on teams like the Diamondbacks and Red Sox. Multiple-time All-Star player, 3-time league champ, in 2 Hall of Fames for the Phillies and Red Sox, the guy is huge in baseball. On top of that, he's an avid gamer, and we're talking both tabletop and video games. His favorite was Advanced Squad Leader, a tabletop game he invested loads of time into, and even joined an independent publisher to get the rights to the game away from Hasbro. Somebody should introduce Curt Schilling to Magic. On top of that was an addiction to MMOs like EverQuest and World of Warcraft. This wasn't a small part of his life, he was a really dedicated gamer. So right before his retirement from baseball in 2006, Curt set up his very own game studio, Green Monster Games. He said this had nothing to do with the Green Monster in Fenway. This must have been based on stuff he saw under his bed. One quick name change to 38 Studio, based on his pro number, and the team would set out for an extremely ambitious first project. Considering Curt's love for MMOs in particular, the decision was made to start the studio off by making one. Project Copernicus was going to be a reverse World of Warcraft. Where that was a game set in the pre-established world of the Warcraft RTS games, Copernicus would be the start of the world of Amalur. That world would have some impressive names tied to it, with less impressive RBIs than its founder, in the form of comics artist Todd McFarlane and fantasy writer R.A. Salvatore. This wasn't it either. Other staff at 38 Studio included former developers from the very games that inspired Copernicus, EverQuest and World of Warcraft. And to help with development, 38 Studio bought Big Huge Games from THQ. It's a very bold strategy, starting a new MMO in the middle of a gold rush spurred by WoW. This game didn't just have to prove its setting, it had to prove the entire company. The structure, like I said, was backwards. WoW had a built-in player base from Blizzard's previous games to buoy it before its massive boom. So, to start in reverse, without that player base, was risky as hell. With Kurt's funding, though, it might be enough to make it work. Should probably get Rhode Island in on this one. So, you might have heard of all those hirings for 38 Studio, and rightly thought, this is a lot. A lot for a company who had never shipped a game before, whose very first game would take years and years to develop, and whose entire money source was one guy. Kurt's plan to secure more funding was simple. After failing to get it in Massachusetts from private investors and local government, he would move down to Rhode Island to search for funds. This was in 2010, a time when Rhode Island was facing a 12% unemployment rate, and was desperate to bring jobs to the state. Donald Carcieri, the then governor of the state, made a deal with Curt Schilling. By bringing 38 Studio to Rhode Island, 38 Studio would get a $75 million investment, with the promise 38 would create 450 new jobs by 2012. This $75 million, which would only really be $50 million up front, with the rest coming after the game's success, would add on to the at least $40 million that Kurt had used from his personal funds to keep Copernicus alive, and bring in all that new, fresh talent. What would become Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning had anywhere from a $70 million to $100 million budget, depending on if you include development costs from the MMO that became the game that released. Yeah, partway into development, they realized an MMO just wasn't gonna happen and switched over to a new format, taking a prototype that Big Huge Games had been working on and tailoring the Amalur setting and lore to that. Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning would launch in 2012, and against all odds, people liked it. This was a brand new franchise that had to impress out of the gate, and largely it did. Despite stiff competition from other similar fantasy RPGs like Skyrim and Dragon Age, Amalur had enough going for it to set itself apart and build up a player base. It leans really hard into the action RPG name, and has more in common with a hack and slash than the games I mentioned before. As well, it has a unique approach to things we've seen in a lot of other action RPGs, like a progression system that lets you switch specializations to get the best of all the classes, and make a custom class that plays totally distinctly to your playstyle. If you have the chance, it's worth checking out. All of these different people and factors working to make the game made something that really does stand on its own. That quality was reflected in positive reviews, 8s, 9s, even a few rare 10 out of 10s. The sales were also well above what publisher EA had expected, as within 90 days, the game had sold 1 million copies. A brand new IP hit 1 million sales in less than 3 months. This was nothing less than a smashing success. Unfortunately, smashing success was the ground floor. They had to do a lot better if they were going to dig themselves out of their hole. Rhode Island's projections were that 38 Studio would have to sell 3 million copies in order to make back the game's budget, and it didn't make it there, not even close. Had the game had a normal development cycle, it might have made it there, but with how much had happened from the Green Monster days to now, Amalur had a massively inflated price tag. It would also be a dark day for math addicts, as they learned 38 did not equal 450, as by 2012, when the game launched, they only had 400 people working at the studio. Of course, there was still time to expand, but with the game failing financially, growth was the last thing on anybody's mind. The size of the studio would have to be reduced to nothing in May of 2012, when the due date for the first $1 million bill from Rhode Island passed, and the company defaulted, resulting in massive layoffs. These layoffs were especially brutal for over 200 of those 400 employees, who, as a part of the push to get jobs into Rhode Island, moved to the state in a relocation program. Part of that program was 38 Studios helping the employees sell their previous houses so they could buy new ones in Rhode Island. A lot of those employees, though, didn't have their houses sold. 38 Studios just didn't do it. As a result, those affected weren't just jobless, but suddenly found themselves having to pay 2 mortgages. One on the house they got in Rhode Island, and the one they'd left to 38 Studios that they were supposed to sell. They wouldn't be getting much help from the company either way, since due to the lack of assets left after the game's launch, many employees spent their last days at 38 without a paycheck. Much of the internal blame from higher-ups in 38 Studios was placed at the feet of Lincoln Chaffee, the new governor of Rhode Island after Donald left. Lincoln was one of the people initially opposed to the idea of working with 38 Studios before Donald pushed forward and approved the loan. So now in power, Lincoln did everything he could to distance the state from 38, calling the loan potentially the worst investment in the state's history. With no money, no employees, and the state threatening to kick their asses, the higher-ups at 38 Studios, Kurt included, paid out $61 million as 38 Studios was shuttered, their now empty office building on the same street as the Rhode Island Capitol building. Regardless of the quality of Kingdoms of Amalur, which is incredibly high, this is a story all about overinflated expectations. Expecting your first project to be an MMO, expecting one studio to turn your state into a new tech capital, expecting the company that said they would sell your house to sell your house. Broken dreams litter all of 38 Studios' history. And as for where the big man himself ended up, oh, he is a gamer! Now this is all very complicated. I mean, Rhode Island is a big place. Well, it's bigger than you are. How about a nice, easy disaster to end things out? We start in Japan with the doujinshi magazine No No How, and its creator, Takashi Okazaki. From a young age, Ozaki had been a fan of hip-hop and rap music thanks to the import of the American TV show Soul Train, which manifested in his combination of Black America with traditional Japan to make Afro Samurai. Afro Samurai is not a series interested in confusing the audience. Afro Samurai is about a samurai named Afro, searching the land for a man named Justice in possession of the #1 headband. If you have the #1 headband, you're the strongest person in the world, and can only be challenged by the holder of the #2 headband. Afro just happens to have that #2 headband, and is looking for revenge, since Justice got the #1 headband from Afro's dead dad. The #2 headband, though, is up for grabs to anybody who can kill #2, so Afro has to fight all comers on his way to fighting Justice and getting revenge. Afro Samurai's story is serviceable, a good tale about how revenge corrupts and isn't fulfilling. The real draw to the series is the artwork. A controlled chaos of fast sword swings that feels messy without ever being hard to parse. The use of red especially makes the blood feel visceral and every kill super violent. What you're looking at right now, though, is not the original doujinshi. That wasn't well circulated and hasn't gotten a proper scanning outside of a few No No How magazine covers. What this is the 2008 and 9 remake made by Takashi Okazaki to capitalize on Afro Samurai's sudden explosion in popularity. A friend of Okazaki had made figures of the Afro Samurai characters, one of which ending up at Gonzo KK, an animation studio you'd know for its contribution to games like KOF, BlazBlue, and Street Fighter. While it certainly would have been popular with just this combination of story and studio after Gonzo decided to make a limited-run series of Afro Samurai, nobody saw coming the involvement of Samuel L. Jackson, Jules Winfield from Pulp Fiction, Mace Windu from Star Wars, Nick Fury from the MCU. What was he doing getting involved in this? Well, Jackson is actually a big fan of anime, with classics like Kite and Ninja Scroll starting his fandom. Upon finding the funding trailer for Afro Samurai that Gonzo put out to get investors, he was instantly on board and got into contact with Gonzo to ask about being a part of it. Jackson's involvement bled into every part of the show. From voicing Afro himself, as well as the man so nice they named him twice, Ninja, Jackson would give input on the direction of the story, lure in other famous actors like Ron Perlman, Lucy Liu, and Mark Hamill, got the RZA of the Wu-Tang Clan on as a music consultant, and secured Afro Samurai a massive $1 million per episode budget. Afro Samurai would make a massive impact on the anime scene in America, not only being the first anime ever nominated for an Emmy, but also giving the huge community of Black anime fans a piece that actually represented them without a neck-snapping amount of collar-tugging. Guys, we need to run PR, get the Nazi in here, stat! Along with the anime, the remade manga, and 2 additional movies, Afro Samurai would also get a video game tie-in with just as much love. It would include the voice cast and soundtrack from the show, and have Bandai Namco behind its development. The game doesn't want you to know that. I didn't realize this when I started, but this is actually a twofer entry. All of this was meant to be set up for what's coming, but Afro Samurai 1 has a similar case of one-and-done development. Afro Samurai's 2009 release date put it in the middle of a time where the gaming public was still a bit gun-shy about fully embracing Japanese developers. The days of super racist G4 segments were not that far in the past. As a part of the failed westward expansion, that was the style of the time, Bandai Namco formed an internal publishing label called Surge. Namco Bandai has a certain image they like to upkeep, and that isn't a very bloody image. This is a company who published loads of Tamagotchi, Anime Fighters, and Pac-Man games. More violent games under their belts, like Dark Souls, Ace Combat, or Tekken, while certainly not bloodless and mature in their own right, aren't nearly as violent as Afro Samurai was shaping up to be. As an attempt to create distance between the image of the company and the more mature games they wanted to publish, Surge was created as a way to sell Americans on Bamco Nandai games without using the Nando Bamkai name. Afro Samurai would be the first attempt at this, with the second likely being the soon-to-release Splatterhouse revival, being worked on by the same team as Afro Samurai. That wouldn't happen though, as Afro Samurai was the only game ever released under the Surge label. As for the game itself, I'd love to talk about it, but unfortunately I'm really dumb and was tricked again! I tried buying Mortal Kombat vs. DC off of eBay, didn't work. Tried buying Afro Samurai off of eBay, didn't work. I got a copy of Deadly Premonition I bought off eBay, and at this point I'm too scared to try. I'm sorry I can't give my personal feelings on the game, but as for the mass opinion on the game, it's fine. The game saw praise for the spectacle, graphics, and simple gameplay, while criticized for its lackluster boss fights and terrible platforming. I'd love to agree, but God hates me! However, something to note is that Namco didn't just have the rights to make an Afro Samurai game, they actually have the rights to make 2 games. Back in 2005, they announced the games alongside the release of the anime's trailer, but we only ever saw that first game. The second game wouldn't come out for another 6 years, when Afro Samurai 2: Kuma's Revenge was released on PS4 and PC. Bandai Namco would be uninvolved, as Gonzo would instead go with the brand new Redacted Studios to develop the game, and leave publishing to Versus Evil. Redacted Studios, which was their name, they're not hiding the first word, was made up of a variety of ex-Bandai Namco employees, a total of 12 of them having worked on the original Afro Samurai. This includes Redacted President David S. Robinson, who would be working as the lead designer, Alan Hopkins, Gene Bang, and Chester Vergara, just to name a few. The rest of the development team would be made up of unknown developers who have no previously released games. Moby Games, again coming in clutch, shows that a lot of the developers on this game only ever worked on one, Afro Samurai 2. No previously credited works. That's fine though, it's not a sign of low quality or cutting corners. It could just be a team giving a chance to younger developers for them to cut their teeth. It is a little bit weird though to see these sorts of developers in roles like lead and senior programmers though, especially with no junior programmers for them to have seniority over. They'd also be reuniting with previous Afro Samurai alums in Yuri Lowenthal and Phil Lamar as voice actors, and the RZA as an executive producer and soundtrack supervisor. Luckily for Redacted, there was a character like Kuma to base the game around instead of Afro himself. Yuri Lowenthal can't be cheap, but he's not Samuel L. Jackson expensive. The game opens with Afro and Ninja taking hard shots to the throat, which render them mute for the next 8 levels. Moreover, this would be the first of many. Afro Samurai 2 would be an episodic release, Dark Dreams Don't Die style. That is a very specific bad style to be. The release of the game's first episode would go cataclysmically bad. Afro Samurai 2 is one of the worst hack and slashes of all time, releasing in a state I struggle to call finished. The game looks abysmal. The style is fine, but the actual graphics are loaded with glitches. Effects like fog are awkward white sheets. There's aggressive slowdown that the game might be able to pass off as cinematic if it wasn't so bad. Pop-in is super noticeable, it just doesn't look like the game got any of the attention it needed. Even in the pre-release footage, the game doesn't run well. This is them selling you the game. You want to buy this after watching this. Combat is significantly worse than the first one, with 3 styles to swap between and none of them being fun to use. Despite the combat being so simple, it's been dumbed down even more from the first game, a feature that was touted as an improvement over the first game.
Afro was a very hardcore game in the past. We've shrunken that down to a very tactical situation where you're hitting one button with modifiers, you're updating your character and investing in that character's style.
As the first episode of a wider story, it does a terrible job as setup. Instead of starting and then telling its own story, the game treats its entire 3-hour runtime as the starting section of what would be the following episodes. Finding anything good in this game is really hard. The only thing of quality is the manga panel cutscenes drawn by Okazaki himself. Besides that, there is nothing to appreciate in this game. It fails on every level. As a maiden voyage for Redacted games, this was a disaster, and the aftermath reflects that. Redacted would never work on another game, and the people who worked on it would see little, if any, work after this. A common thing amongst the credits for Afro Samurai 2 is that this was either the only game they worked on, or the last game they worked on. Finding anybody who got work after this game is really hard. Those looking to try it for themselves to see how bad it is are also out of luck, because Afro Samurai 2 was so bad, the publishers had to step in. Versus Evil went scorched earth and totally wiped the game from existence. The game's pages on PS4 and Steam were taken down, and the Xbox One port cancelled. The PlayStation and Steam users who bought the game were issued a full refund. Versus Evil general manager Steve Escalante would answer the question of what was going on in one of the most frank interview responses I've ever seen from a publisher. The game was a failure. We could not do, in good conscience, Volume 2 and Volume 3. So we've begun the process. It's been a long process to figure it out because Sony has never really had to do this in this way. But we're returning all the money. So, across the board, we're putting out an apology saying, sorry about this. It was worth more to the publishers to delist the game and tank the cost of development than it would be to keep the game out there and damage their reputation. This would also be their burden to bear entirely, as Versus Evil was the sole funder of the game. Gonzo or any outside party didn't put up any money to get the game made, only Versus Evil. The refunds probably didn't amount to much, as in a different interview for Gamasutra, Steve mentioned sales were about what you'd expect for a game called one of the worst of the year. Given the game's quality was not what people were expecting, it didn't sell like hotcakes, let's just put it like that. Since then, Versus Evil has managed to rebound unlike Redacted Games, publishing indie titles like Little Guardsmen. I have a story about Little Guardsmen. I'm not allowed to tell it. So what did we learn to do? God damn it. What? No, come on! Fucking close the ad. New 10-cent studio working on AAA open world games closes without ever releasing anything? This studio didn't get one game!